Good evening, everyone. On behalf of its warden, staff, and students, welcome to Trinity College and to this year's Hughes-Cheong lecture. My name is Bob Derenbacher, and it's my privilege to serve as the Dean of the Theological School here at Trinity. As we begin, let me formally acknowledge that we meet this evening on the sovereign and unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to any Indigenous peoples here tonight and to their elders past and present as the primary custodians of this land. Here at Trinity College, we are committed to advancing the cause of reconciliation and to the search for a lasting and just settlement with the Indigenous peoples of this country in all that we do, think, teach, and pray. I would also like to wish all our Muslim friends present here tonight a happy and blessed Ramadan. We do have a space for prayer reserved just outside this lecture theater on the ground floor in room G04. I also invite any observing Ramadan to break their fast at the conclusion of this lecture in the atrium, where there will be food and drink available, including a bowl full of dates. Now, before I introduce the lecture and our lecturer, I would like to alert everyone to the QR code on the screen behind me. If you scan this QR code on your smartphone, you'll be taken to the Slido app, where you will be able to submit questions for our Q&A at the conclusion of tonight's lecture. Please log in now if you'd like to by either scanning the QR code or typing the code on the screen behind me at slido.com. You can then begin posting any questions to Slido during the course of this evening's lecture. The Hughes-Cheong Lectures are a series of biennial addresses hosted by Trinity College and funded by a generous endowment in honor of two remarkable former priests of St. Peter's Eastern Hill, Father Ernest Selwyn Hughes and Father James Cheong. Ordained in 1887, Father Ernest served as curate at St. Mark's in Fitzroy and then at St. Peter's in the London Docklands. On his return to Melbourne in 1894, he was appointed assistant priest at St. Peter's Eastern Hill, becoming its vicar in 1900, an appointment he would retain until his retirement in 1926. Father James, like Father Ernest, an alumnus of Trinity College, Melbourne, was ordained deacon in England after studying at Cuddesdon College before being priested in Melbourne in 1906. From then until his death in 1941, he served as assistant priest at St. Peter's Eastern Hill. This year, we're very pleased that the Hughes-Cheong Lecture is co-sponsored by Pilgrim Theological College through the J.D. Northey Bequest for Public Theology. Since 2020, Trinity College has administered the Hughes-Cheong Trust and has been privileged to host several world-class scholars as the Hughes-Cheong lecturers, including Professor Miroslav Volf in 2014, and then in 2022, Professor Willie James Jennings, both of Yale Divinity School. Tonight, we are thrilled to have another eminent scholar with us, Dr. Joshua Ralston. A graduate of Emory, Wake Forest, and Edinburgh universities, Dr. Ralston is currently Reader in Christian-Muslim Relations in the University of Edinburgh School of Divinity. A prolific author, Dr. Ralston has published 3 books, including his groundbreaking 2020 monograph, Law and the Rule of God, A Christian Engagement with Sharia. Dr. Ralston is currently working on his next project related to sports washing and the Gulf states, as well as a book entitled Witness and the Word. For the past 3 months, Dr. Ralston has been a visiting scholar here at Trinity College. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Joshua Ralston?
Let me begin with a word of thanks and a word of apology. The word of apology is that you might have seen Edinburgh and were expecting a Scottish brogue, and instead are hearing another ubiquitous American accent. The words of thanks are to all of you at Trinity, at Pilgrim, and more broadly here in Melbourne for the hospitality and generosity over the last 11 and 12 weeks. It has been an incredible opportunity to have my first summer in 9 years, having lived in Scotland for nearly a decade as a former Californian, and to have received conversations, friendships, meals, especially thanks to all of the faculty and staff at Trinity, to Bob, to Ken, to Carol, to so many others. It's a real honor and a privilege. I'm also not nearly the eminent and world-class scholar of the two previous lecturers, so I hope, though, that I can live up to them and not make your evening too boring. I never expected to be a theologian engaged with Islam. My plan was to be a proper Christian theologian. In that sense, it was to engage in questions of scripture, tradition, philosophy, and politics. But friendships and world events combined changed the course of my life. And I've tried to make sense of those two experiences in the book that I'm currently, hopefully, nearly finishing. And I want to give you a little bit of a taster of some of that. As I said, I'm a native Californian, and it wasn't until far into my 20s that I actually developed any friendships with Muslims. But as I said yesterday at Pilgrim, I was born in 1979, the year of the Iranian Revolution, and my first day at work as a chaplain at Stanford University happened to be 9/11. So those world events have in some ways bookended and been the backdrop of much of my intellectual work. However, even during those times, I found something somewhat disturbing about interreligious dialogue, a quest for sameness that didn't take our particularity serious. It is commonly assumed, I think, that what makes Christian-Muslim relations and Christian-Muslim theological exchange uniquely challenging are the fundamental disagreements over central confessions in each religious traditions. The unity or triunity of God. Who is this Jesus of Nazareth? Sharia, the prophethood of Muhammad, as well as the human condition. It is thought that these theological differences are what lead to social and political debate, wars and rumors of war, and conflict. In the face of these intractable differences, it is further presumed then that the goal of interfaith dialogue and Christian-Muslim encounter is to find a new productive path forward. To turn to deep commonalities is what is needed to forget the past. The most common theological basis for this, and I'll return to it in a moment, are understandings of God as the creator and sustainer of the world, the heritage of Abraham, or the call to justice and social action. While these theological ideas have had constructive exchanges and improved Christian-Muslim relations in some ways, my current work challenges this assumption and argues that the fundamental difference is between Christians and Muslims is in fact not the biggest obstacle between relations, and that theological commonality should not necessarily be the quest for interreligious engagement. It is in fact my contention, and you can disagree with me, that commonality is just as much, if not more so, the primary challenge facing Christian-Muslim debate. It is not difference, but apparent commonality. Like an American in Britain saying the word pants. We're saying something but misunderstanding one another. That's a nod to Dan, one of his favorite examples. Now, it may appear counterintuitive to claim that commonality is a key source of the intractable difference and often vitriolic disagreements between Christians and Muslims. For a cursory glance at major text in the history of the two religions illustrates the opposite. The most common topic of polemics, for instance, are disagreements over God, Scripture, prophethood, and the like. Two examples. John of Damascus's views of Islam as the Ishmaelite heresy, written in the 700s, and Ibn Hazm's critique of the corruption of Christian scripture, both focus on how the other tradition diverges from proper understandings of law, theology, scripture, or ritual practice. The problem they identify are not similarities in philosophical notions of monotheism, but diverging accounts of God, ritual, and scripture. So why then am I claiming that more attention needs to be given to the problem of commonality? Difference, we know, is an obvious source of disagreement and recrimination. However, it is my sense that the particular vitriol, and I do think there is a particular vitriol between Christians and Muslim relations, and we could sometimes add Jewish as well, is in large part caused by a combustible combination of having a shared conceptual framework but diverging theological norms of judgment. So let's return to those three common assumptions of what we need to work to in commonality. The first being the notion that Christians and Muslims alike worship and praise the one God, creator and sustainer of the world, master of the day of judgment. And while, of course, Christians and Muslims do share a confession in the God of Abraham, that this God is unique and unlike anything else, not one kind amongst others, but the very ground of our being, they diverge quite significantly on how they understand the meaning of this one God. Take these two photos, one taken from Paderborn, which is an image of the Trinity, and the other a confession of the unity of God as expressed in the Islamic notion of Tawheed. So even appeals to there being one God often leaves open the question of whether or not we're talking about the same God. Often, as we saw back in 2016 at Wheaton College in the United States, the very claim that a Christian might make that Christians and Muslims share some idea of God leads to such problematic arguments that someone is dismissed from their job. Similarly, Muslims often accuse Christians of exceeding their religion and being guilty of shirk or associating something with God. So the notion that simply because we have a shared philosophical framework that that's sufficient proves to be illusory, as I'll get to in a second. Similarly, scholarship points to the shared story of Abraham. I'm sure all of you have heard the term Abrahamic religions. But many of you, if you take a slightly closer look, realize that while Abraham or Ibrahim or Avraham is shared by Christians, Muslims, and Jews, the telling of the story of Abraham is in fact fundamentally shaped by later claims. I have my students do an assignment in which they look at Paul's writing on the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, and compare it with various Islamic texts about the story of Abraham. And what you realize when you read those and then go back to the Genesis story is the ways in which both the Christian telling and the Muslims telling diverge actually in some fundamental ways from the story in Genesis. Because in some part, the telling of the story of Abraham by Paul is meant to reinforce his emerging account of Jesus of Nazareth's importance of the gospel. Similarly, the stories of Abraham in the Quran and the Hadith and Tafsir seem to situate Abraham as almost a prototype of Muhammad. Here we have a photo that I took in Hebron, which illustrates that this isn't simply a shared theological disagreement. You have your Abraham, I have mine, let's all get along. But in fact, touches on one of the core political and social conflicts of our day. The Mosque of the Patriarchs, now divided in two, half a synagogue, half a mosque. But this is not a place of reconciliation, but a place of rivalry and death. So then, why don't we shift to social justice? A very similar claim is often made. Let's forget about theology. That's for you philosophers. Let's care about the environment, care about the poor, do social justice. And again, like Abraham and like God, as I'll explain later, there are possibilities here. But if the aim is simply to find a pre-existing shared commonality that can be the framework for further engagement, we'll realize quickly that we are not on solid rock, but on slipping sand. This photo was taken by a friend of mine in Tahrir Square in the year 2011, shortly after rivalry and violence erupted between Coptic Christians and Muslims on Ash Wednesday. 9 Christians were killed, 5 Muslims were killed, a church was destroyed, a mosque was said to have been burnt down, and a few days later, Christians and Muslims gathered together in Tahrir to chant about Christians and Muslims of being in one hand, here in a moment of shared solidarity that didn't erase difference, as you can see in the image, but sought some better quest for social justice. Something, of course, that I affirm and agree with, but it wasn't a foundation that could be sustained if you followed the debates not only in Egypt, but in other places. Debates about how Sharia would function in the new Egyptian state after Mubarak. Questions of whether or not a church should or should not be built. Whether a woman could be divorced as a Christian. Turned out to be just as much a source of intractable difference. I don't know about politics in Australia, but as far as I know from the politics in the United States or the politics in Britain, claims of whose justice, which politics, turns out to be even more vitriolic often than theology. So where then do we go? It is my argument then that there is no Islamic account of God or Abraham that is entirely free from the distinctive claims of the Quran and the Hadith. Nor are there any accounts of Abraham, God, or justice in Christianity that are not shaped in some ways, directly or indirectly, by the claims of Jesus of Nazareth's gospel. So, rather than focusing on dialogue being about shared commonalities or seeking out a shared theological platform, which often assumes an a priori agreement, it is my sense that Christian-Muslim encounter needs to have a different aim. Not agreement, but engagement. A mode of contestation, mutual exchange, where the history of polemics and rivalry is taken seriously, but maybe chastened a bit, and becomes a mode for theological discovery and mutual learning. Drawing on recent work in comparative theology by figures like Catherine Cornell, Daniel Madigan, and others, but altering in some ways to account for the longer history of Christian-Muslim conflict, my work tries to argue that we can think of Christian-Muslim relations as an act of mutual bearing witness. Why do I argue this? The call to bear witness is a recurring invitation and even demand in both the New Testament and the Quran, as well as in longer Islamic and Christian history. For instance, in the prologue to the Gospel according to John, the author describes John the Baptizer as one that is, quote, sent to bear witness to the light. Similarly, in the post-resurrection accounts of both Matthew and Acts, the disciples are tasked with bearing witness to Jesus Christ. In the Islamic tradition, it shares an overlapping, albeit distinct, focus on the category of witness. The primary criteria for becoming a Muslim is simply to recite the Shahada, a term that means testimony or witness, and derives from the Arabic root for that term, shahada. All Arabic has roots. We don't need to get into that. If you know it, you already know it. If you don't, it'll be confusing. In one sense, to be a Muslim is to be one that bears witness. The centrality of witness is reinforced each day in the 5 daily calls to prayer, one that will happen in 5 minutes if you need to leave and eat, in which the muezzin calls out, Ashahadu, I bear witness that there is no God but God. Ashahadu, I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God. And throughout the Quran, there are numerous mentions of the importance of bearing witness to the unity and uniqueness of God. God is said to have taken the children of Adam and made them, quote, bear witness in the 7th surah to God. Even as God is a, quote, witness that there is no deity but God. God witnesses to God's own self. In the collection and the codification of the Hadith, the status of the human witness was and is remaining central to the trustworthiness of it. The moral category and veracity of the witness is central to justifying the ongoing moral, legal, and ethical power of the Hadith. For an individual Hadith or saying or collection of the Prophet and his companions to be considered sahih or authentic, it must be grounded in a faithful and just witness. Now, have I just come up with a 4th category, different from the 3 that I've always critiqued? Yes, in one sense, but in another sense, my argument is that witness is indigenous to both religious traditions, but also supple enough to not presuppose shared agreement. That's my issue with the claim of God, justice, or Scripture or Abraham. It's meant to be a foundation rather than something that we engage with. In fact, one of the benefits of considering Christian-Muslim relation through the lens of witness is that it remains open-ended and dynamic. To bear witness, whether it's in law or a relationship, think of it outside of just religion, is to give an account of oneself, a testimony of one's experience, of one's knowledge. But it's one that's also contestable and leaves space for cross-examination, debate, and hopefully even mutual learning. For instance, central to the personalism of the Muslim Moroccan philosopher Muhammad Aziz Lahbibi is the act of bearing witness, especially through the Shahada. He argues that by bearing witness, one enters into a historical material horizon, takes their meanness and finds a we-ness in solidarity with others. To bear witness is to enter into history and into community with others. Witness then makes an individual a part of a community. But in being part of a community and part of history, one is also entering into debate, contestation, and argument. While the category of witness might, for many of you or for some of you, conjure up negative images of proselytizing or polemics, I think a proper attention to theological claims about God's otherness or transcendence and the role in conversion presses against such interpretation. To bear witness is, as in that famous Grunwald altarpiece that I showed earlier, is to point away from oneself, not towards oneself. Witness is then neither polemics nor apology. It's giving an account. In fact, as Karl Barth quipped in his seminal commentary on Romans, no divinity which needs anything, any human propaganda, can in fact be God. Right? That the act of witness is not propaganda, but testimony. In fact, a strong view of God's otherness, whether grounded in Christian or Islamic tradition, presents a check against an account of witness as a possession to be held or argued or defended. Witness is a giving away of one's claim. Lee Murray Tonstad of Yale as well suggests that a theology that recognizes its own proclivity towards failure, its own incompleteness, will offer its propositions tentatively and open-handedly. And it is the act of witness that we open our hands to this. This is not to say that Christian theology or Islamic claims should give up on truth claims or their particularity. In fact, it is through the very act of witness and counter-witness that learning occurs. I learn by making a claim and having it engaged with others. Through the practice of witness and counter-testimony, we engage in a new pursuit of justice and truth in the world. In some of my time remaining, I want to drill down a little bit more deeply into how we think about this and to connect it to current philosophical debates in the philosophy of testimony. This is for the academics. Over the last, you might be thinking, this whole thing's for the academics, I want to go home. There's drinks soon and food. Over the last decades, a major debate in the field of epistemology of philosophy has taken place over the warrants of testimonial knowledge. Put differently, how do we know what we know? And how much of it comes from the testimony of others? Think for a moment of how you know the world is round, a plane flies, a vaccine works, the sun will set. Some of it, of course, is experience. Some of it is testimonial knowledge. Some of it, I'm sure you have checked that testimonial knowledge. My local sandwich man has checked that the earth is not in fact round, right? So there is a sense of giving and taking, and there's a debate about this. In fact, most of our knowledge, philosophers recognize, is in fact testimonial. And this is true not only of much knowledge, but also of theological knowledge. Whether or not we want to follow Schleiermacher and Rahner and argue that God's grace encounters us through a feeling of absolute dependence or precognitive knowledge, this experience is always shaped and interpreted in history through bringing our testimony into the world. It is, in this sense, theological knowledge is always testimonial. For Christians, Scripture is a testimony to God's revelation, and in the case of Islam, the Quran is in fact God's testimony to humanity. So, what does this relate to philosophy of testimony? In her recent work, Jennifer Lackey, a feminist philosopher of testimony, both in a 2008 book, Learning from Words, and a 2023 book on testimonial injustice, has added significant nuance to thinking about knowledge production and testimony. Her work is not particularly concerned with interreligious knowledge, but I think it has something to offer us. Moreover, her work can help us account for the tendency, I think, of both Christians and Muslims, as well as secular people, to demonize, ignore, or belittle the knowledge and claims of others. In this way, her work may assist comparative theologians who understand engagement across religious boundaries to be necessary for theology. First, her approach in her book, Learning from Words, proposes a middle ground between what we call reductionist and non-reductionist knowledge accounts of testimony. We won't need to get into the details of this, but she argues a middle ground that testimony is not about the beliefs of the testimonier, but of their words. We do not learn, she says, from another's beliefs, we learn from their words. We don't need to actually take on the whole belief system of the testifier to gain knowledge from them. This contradicts other views that say you have to trust the entire belief system of who gives you knowledge. The knowledge that we received is not then merely a passing on, but is in fact more dynamic, where the speaker and the hearer together, as well as their words and meaning, become vital for knowledge production. This can include both indirect exchanges through teachers or textbooks, but also through primary sources of history, right? So we learn, she argues, through the testimony of others, but the testimony of others is in part their words, not necessarily always their beliefs. The focus on words and the encounter between the speaker and hearer, and not merely their beliefs, opens up a space to consider how testimony across religious communities might actually produce new knowledge, without demanding agreement on every belief behind these statements. That's important for me. It might not be for you. Let's take an example from Christian-Muslim comparative theology. Lackey's view on testimony as learning about words allows us, who are not Muslims, to consider how Muslim claims that God has sent the prophet, Muhammad, or how the Quran calls Christians and Jews to not exceed their religion, can be received and engaged by Christian theologians, maybe even as a source for theology, without necessarily assenting to the entire framework of Islamic theology. This aids us in one of the recurring challenges and opportunities that I named before, how we have diverging and yet overlapping narratives. And there's a tendency to say, well, if we diverge, we have to reject everywhere that we overlap, but if we overlap, we have to ignore the parts that we diverge, if that makes sense. And she's proposing a way otherwise. The focus on learning from words in Lackey is significant, but she's been critiqued for failing to account for the social realities of testimony. Miranda Fricker most famously has talked about what she calls epistemic injustice, a bias that results in pernicious forms of the rejecting of the other. More recently, Lackey has advanced her work significantly with a new book on testimonial injustice. The primary focus on her work is forms of criminal courts, but I think it applies for Christian theology. First, she argues that there are biases against a certain community or individual, such as that means we don't take their knowledge seriously. Think here of educational levels in Britain, accents, race, socioeconomic, gender identity, as a source that means we don't attend seriously to their ideas. The import for comparative theology in Christian-Muslim relations is fairly obvious and clear here. As the history of polemics testifies, I don't need to belabor it. Rather than taking Islam or Muslims as serious interlocutors, one that addresses Christians and demands a response, Christian theologians, and Muslim theologians often as well, have dismissed the other as a pale imitation of the truth. So John of Damascus views Islam as a Christian heresy, Luther views it as works righteousness, Schleiermacher considers it a return to Greek paganism. None of them really actually engage with Islam. We can call this a form of bias that amounts to false testimony against our neighbor. However, I think for those of us in the room that might think of ourselves as more open-minded or ecumenical, maybe we've moved past some of these biases. Lackey's work also shows us something that might be hiding in plain sight, what she calls hearer excess. This is a type of epistemic excess that doesn't belittle or give false witness to the other, but instead puffs oneself up. The result is a credibility excess of oneself and one's imagined peers that results either in a dismissal or a patronizing turn to the other. So they don't necessarily reject Muslims as false witnesses in this case, but simply say, well, what you say we already have. And it's this tendency, I think, amongst liberal theologians that we see all too often, even in the quest for commonality. This doesn't need to be through polemics, but in a simple elevation of oneself. This is internal to both traditions. Think of how Maliki jurists prefer other Maliki jurists over Shafi'i jurists. If you don't know what that means, I'll explain it later. Or the ways, no offense to any Karl Barth scholars, that they'll strain a gnat through vast deluges of his writings to try to justify his position on women, because he's given excess, right? He can't be wrong, or she can't be wrong, or I tradition can't be wrong. And it's that form of pernicious excess hearing that I think has become fundamental in much Muslim-Christian dialogue, such that when we engage with one another, we're not actually engaging with one another in a sense of real learning. I have some fellow comparative theologians in Islam and Christianity that I won't name, who I think very highly of, but often feel there's an excess of one's own tradition that one can't actually hear the no of the other, the rejection of Christianity by Muslims that has to sting a little, or their critique of religion from secular. There's a way in which we can simply fold it in without changing. Does that make sense, this idea? And it's this hearer excess that I think, especially for those of us who think of ourselves as open-minded, whether it's to other religions, races, we need to be particularly aware of. We're the good liberals or open-minded folk. But in the process, one doesn't actually take seriously the critiques of the other, whether that's from religion or not. This is a tendency, then, to think that the Christian tradition already contains within itself all that is necessary to know or say about God, about the world, about salvation. And so what is it that I can learn from a non-Christian. That's a quote from the Quran. My own work in comparative theology was in part, as I said earlier, caused by the unsettling experience of realizing that I was being educated in a world of here excess, within a community of testimony and scholarship that assumed that Christian doctrines, philosophical conditions, even liberation theology from within Christianity didn't know how to listen or include non-Christian theologies. It was friendships with three boys, Ibrahim, Amr, and Tamar, and their testimonies as Muslims that unsettled me. The questions that they asked about God, about justice, about God's oneness, about how Christians could do justice in the world when also asking the poor to turn the other cheek, forced me to begin again at the beginning and reflect afresh on Christian theology. Not necessarily to simply to give a theology of Islam, but to take Islam seriously as a conversation partner in the very act of writing Christian theology. Christian theology, I'm coming to the end, is in some sense arbitrary. That is to say, it is random. That is not to say that it is random, for it will inevitably engage with questions about God, the world, justice, sin and salvation, Christ and the church. Just like Islamic theology will inevitably engage with questions of God's oneness, the prophethood of Muhammad, and the law. But by arbitrary, I mean that it is taken up in a particular time and place and engages with thinkers, texts, and concerns, hidden assumptions, and political realities that it faces. And it's the theologians, the priests, the philosophers, the churches, the congregations chosen, and yes, it is often chosen choice, of a conversation partner or an interlocutor that impacts and shapes how it does theology in crucial ways. A theologian's decision, for instance, to write theology in a mode of analytic philosophy or scientific theology or contemporary thought will shape it. What counts as coherent or clear or persuasive or beautiful depends in some part who your conversation partner is. Entire academic guilds, from PhD theses to multi-series volumes by senior professors, are given over to the study of the legacies of Hegel or Kant on modern theology, or the forms of Aristotelianism deployed by the scholastics or neo-scholastics, or the participatory metaphysics of Plotinus in Augustine or Basel, or Judith Butler's account of gender on queer theory. What theology looks like is shaped by those conversation partners. And yet, rarely, Christian theologians and Christian churches, in the Western tradition at least, have sought to engage consciously with the questions, challenges, and categories of Islamic thought in a non-polemic and non-apologetic fashion. Engaging with religions in the very act of thinking and writing Christian theology is then rendered outside the bounds of real scholarship, made an optional interfaith path, or viewed as irrelevant to the core of Christian theology. By contrast, engagement with any philosopher or theologian is normal. But is it really the case that philosophy demands theological response and appropriation? Politics does, science does, but other religious traditions, whether they are Muslims or Jews or others, can simply be ignored in the process of writing Christian theology. We can say the same in our local churches, for those of you, I see lots of callers, where it's seemingly normal to engage with your local school council, your secular society, your atheist critics, but engagement with a local mosque or a synagogue is somehow something that needs debated by the bishop or the presbytery or the congregation, optional or additional or extravagant. Why is this the case? They too are our neighbors. And in fact, they're neighbors that bear witness to a God they claim speaks to them too. So, in some simple point, it's my central conviction that there's no inherent reason not to take seriously the testimony of Muslims and to offer our own counter-testimony, but to do it in a way that is marked by what I call humble particularity, a mode of engagement that does not deny our central disagreements and differences. They will remain. The Prophet Muhammad remains central to Islamic claims. Christian accounts of Jesus of Nazareth, who of course is also in the Islamic tradition, remain fundamental to how Christians think, act, and worship. These particularities are not going to go away. We may think of returning to these so-called commonalities, aware that our particularity is marked in some ways intractably by difference, but to do it not triumphantly, but humbly, knowing that the God that we bear witness to exceeds any claims that we may make of that God. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh. That was terrific. Now's your opportunity to address your questions to Josh in Slido. And so this is one way we avoid other lectures happening during the Q&A period. So please direct your questions into Slido, and I will begin to select them. So we've got one that's just come in. Let's see if this works. There we go. So the question is, have you seen in modern days any positive examples of Muslim-Christian engagement that takes difference seriously?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is interesting about the engagement between Christians and Muslims, or engagements more broadly, is that the tendency to elevate the moments of encounter and tension are much more prominent than the common, everyday friendships and mutual learning. And I've had the privilege of living in Egypt, of living in Ramallah, in Jerusalem, of living in a significantly large Muslim community in Atlanta. And so I've had the opportunity to see a lot of these day in, day out examples that don't necessarily make the news. But a more prominent one, these are both ones that also kind of slip away. That's, I think, one of the things you have to be aware of, that often they have these moments of profound interruption, but then the politics and society change them. So I've used the example of Egypt already. I think some of the images that we saw during the original protest in Tahrir, where you had Christians protecting Muslims while they pray, would be an example of this. Similarly, in Jerusalem, now I'm going to get myself into talking about the Israel-Palestine situation, but here we go. In Jerusalem, a few years back, when Muslims were being forbidden from entering into Al-Aqsa, there was a number of Muslims that would intentionally walk towards Al-Aqsa, be stopped by the police, and then stop and pray. And there was an example of a few Christians, Orthodox, going with them, but then they stop and pray, but they're still praying a Christian prayer. They're not doing salat. They have their prayer beads. So here's a moment of shared social justice quest that still takes these differences seriously. Unfortunately, I got put on the wait list for the iftar last week on the University of Melbourne, but that would be another example of ways in which it went to my junk, or maybe they didn't want me, where at a very simple level, you're recognizing I'm not a Muslim, but I'm still open-handedly offering hospitality. That would be another very simple example of these kinds of things. Is there another question coming in, or do you want me to keep? Okay, I'll stop talking then. So those are a few. I think you could probably think of a lot others. Actually, one more really, really profound one. I had the opportunity for 3 years to serve on, this is a mouthful, the World Council of Reformed Churches Task Force on Migration in Europe. What that meant was that I was the only academic on a task force of 8 to 10 people from Hungary, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Italy, Sweden, Greece, Lebanon, that were visiting different places between 2015 and 2018 when the number, mostly Syrian, but also Iraqis, were coming into Europe. And we were able to go to Lampedusa, which is the island that I think it was the Pope's first visit outside of Rome. And we had a shared service there to commemorate the drowning of over 300 people between Catholics and Protestants. But then we also were able to visit a graveyard where atheist Marxists, Catholic Christians, Waldensian Christians, and Muslims worked together to identify the bodies of people that had drowned in sea, to contact their loved ones, and to offer them a burial in their own tradition. To me, this was a profound model of bearing witness to the humanity of those people, to the particularity of their faiths, and would be the most profound example that I could give of both what I'm gesturing towards and to the question.
Thanks, Josh. The questions are now rolling in, so you're not just texting on your iPhones. Here's one. Let's try that. So how does Muslim-Christian dialogue differ from Muslim-Jewish dialogue, if it does?
Yeah, so there is no one single Christian-Muslim dialogue. There is no one single Jewish-Muslim dialogue. There's no one single right. So my dialogue with Muslims are a particular form of Muslims that I know and engage with. They tend to be Sunnis, just because of what I know. I come from a Protestant background, so it's going to be different than if I have students who are Egyptian, right? So it's always going to vary. That's something that's important to see. We never speak for our own tradition. This is another idea of witness. We're speaking from our tradition, but we aren't the spokesperson of it. And that's the same of others, right? You don't ask the Muslim to explain the whole history of their tradition when you're not willing to do that yourself. So that's always going to vary. But I think with Jewish Muslim and Christian Muslim, there's always going to be some amounts of difference and divergence. Islam and Judaism share certain things that Christianity hasn't. Certain accounts of the fundamental nature of halakha and sharia, certain understandings of divine oneness, certain critiques of Christian views of Jesus, even if Islam's view of Jesus is very much higher than Jews. So that's going to be different. The Israel-Palestine conflict is not simply about Judaism and Islam. I don't even think it is primarily about that. But that has come to shape 20th and 21st century Jewish-Muslim dialogue and even Christian-Muslim-Jewish dialogue in very profound ways that would be different before. So there's some areas where Christians and Muslims disagree with Judaism, the notion of the missionary nature of it, for instance. And there's other areas where Jews and Muslims are in more agreement and disagreement with Christianity. So it's always going to be a trialogue and a dialogical situation.
Great, thank you. Another one from Anonymous. When Muslims and Christians engage in debate, what do you think the end goal is / should be? Most debates attempt to convince the other side that they're incorrect. So as I said before, I don't want to deny the divisions and disagreements. But I think there's a way to engage with debate that seeks clarity and mutual learning, even if it ends in you thinking the other person's correct and I'm incorrect, and vice versa. But there's a way to do it in a much more humble and fashion than conflict. But I do have an argument. I mean, when you engage with someone, and even if you disagree with someone, don't move it outside the area of religion. Maybe, of course, there's a desire to give an account of oneself, to persuade the other, right? But I hope oftentimes the best dialogues with your other colleagues, your students, maybe your children or your family or your friends, aren't just about persuading the others, but actually possibly clarifying, refining, and maybe even changing one's own mind. Changing one's mind in light of new ideas isn't a bad thing, despite what our politicians may think, despite what Twitter and Instagram might argue. So essentially one of my
central convictions is that we can think about engagement and debate not simply about proving rightness, but of the possibility of discovery. To use a concrete example from my own engagement with those 3 friends of mine, they didn't turn me into a Muslim. I didn't turn them into a Christian. But I think differently about the Christian tradition. Some of their critiques actually cut right to the heart of it, but I have to live with those. And similarly, some of their ideas about Islam and Christianity changed. We didn't necessarily change our traditions, but we inhabited them differently. And I think that's part of the aim.
Thank you. In what way do you think, or in what ways do you think Christians can learn from Muslims' testimony about the importance of social justice?
My book is now for sale in paperback with Cambridge University. But no, so I wrote an entire book about this, partly because of an intellectual challenge, but also because of a lived challenge. We, for those of us that are not Muslims, often think, if we're Western and liberal and have this notion of secularity, that Muslims being involved in public is kind of a problem. Yes? You know this on the news? You see this on the news? And if they just learn to be more like us and keep their religion private, everything would be okay? Is that a fair summary of a lot of general assumptions of Muslims? Yeah? But what if some of their public religion actually has a critical edge? A critical edge to how we share wealth. A critical edge of what counts as community and justice. A critical edge of what our religion or our philosophy or our theology or our secularism demands of our whole lives. Is it possible to take that seriously without necessarily going the whole way? That's what I'm trying to wrestle with in my own work. And for me, one of that ways is to take the place of public law much more significantly as not something that's settled, but that is contested and engaged. I'll give you an example. A very famous Anglican priest theologian named Kenneth Cragg. He died in early 2000s, was a bishop in Jerusalem for a very long time, and in Lebanon, wrote a number of books. He thought of the early life of the Prophet Muhammad during the Meccan period as very positive, and thought of the latter part of the Prophet Muhammad's life in Medina as essentially trading his prophetic and spiritual role for a political one. That's a simplistic way of his argument, but many people that are on the fence on Muhammad would follow this idea. Fazl Rahman, a Pakistani who taught at the University of Chicago for quite a long time, was critical of this idea because he said the attempt to actually enact justice in the world demands decisions. You can't just say, as Christian and Jewish traditions do, care for the poor, give aid to the widow, seek out the oppressed, in the abstract without concrete decisions. How do you tax someone? What do you do if someone's divorced? How do you share custody? What about property rights? So what Christians or secular people often think of Islam as a overly religious thing, I think for Fazl Rahman and others is an attempt to do justice in the world, which means getting your hands dirty.
Thanks, Josh. And thank you to all the other questions that are coming in. We don't have time to get to all of them because we do need to get to food and drink in just a few moments. But before we do that, I'd like to invite my colleague, the Reverend Associate Professor Robin Whitaker, Acting Head of Pilgrim Theological College, to offer the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Trinity, for hosting. And most of you all, thank you, Dr. Ralston. Pilgrim is delighted to co-sponsor this lecture, and our money comes from the J.D. Northey bequest, which was left for public lectures for, I quote, the enjoyment of theology. For some people, that's a strange idea, but I think tonight we can say we've enjoyed theology. Joshua, I want to thank you for your lecture, for being so engaging and eloquent. I am struck by this idea of humble particularity. I speak as a Christian, aware that in many Christian circles, so often our engagement with our Islamic brothers and sisters is either attempts to convert or to pretend that we are simply all the same. You have spoken a strong word against both of those postures. I am left with the challenge you have offered us, and I think every good lecture challenges and unsettles a little. The ongoing challenge to engage with humility, to avoid excess, but to recognise that there is so much we can learn from one another when we recognise there is difference, and letting that difference speak to us and actually hold up a bit of a mirror to us about our own traditions. And to do that with curiosity and generosity. Lastly, I want to thank you for the work you do, not just tonight, but broadly. Theology really matters. And we live in a world that is so divided, and where religion and politics are often enmeshed in that division. Your work, Joshua, I think is such an important voice into a space that can be so contested. So I thank you for the way you contribute, not just tonight, but more broadly, to being constructive and generous and offering a theology that can hopefully lead to the flourishing of all in society. So will you join me in again showing our thanks to Dr. Joshua Ralston.
Thank you very much, Robin. It's now my pleasure to dismiss us to the atrium for food and drink. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Have a good night.